Let's start by thinking about slavery. When I say slavery, what comes into your mind? You may know a lot about it, you may know very little, but everybody will have an image, an idea, maybe a country. Now think of a person you associate with slavery, a name. Keep those in your head. Whatever background you come from, this subject touches you in some way. We live in a post-colonial society. Maybe when I ask which country you associate with slavery, you might think of the United States. When I ask about a person, you might think of William Wilberforce. Maybe not. You might be much better acquainted with the facts of slavery than most. But Britain is good at collective forgetting. We've been very thorough and successful in erasing slavery from British national consciousness. Two things have made this possible. One is geography, the Caribbean is far away, and the other is our collective fixation with the one redemptive chapter in the whole story, William Wilberforce and the abolitionists. As the historian David Olusoga says, this fixation on the ending of slavery has behaved like a fig leaf behind which the larger, longer and darker history of slavery has been concealed. So I'm now going to start with some background. Again, you may already know these facts and figures, so please bear with me if you do. In all, about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. 10.7 million of these people survived the journey, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean and South America. Well over 90% of enslaved Africans were imported into the Caribbean and South America. Only a small percentage were sent directly to British North America. The British alone shipped around 3.1 million people between 1662 and 1807. North American plantations were dwarfed by those in the West Indies, the present-day Caribbean. The slave trade ended in 1807. North America abolished the trade in 1808. Contrary to the popular myth, this was not just due to the philanthropic nature of English people, but a number of factors. The abolitionist movement played its part, but so did slave rebellions all over the Caribbean, the most significant of which was, of course, Haiti, which was the most profitable sugar colony in the world. It was seized by the slave population who held it, against inconceivable odds, defeating both the French and English armies. This is one of the most astonishing revolutionary achievements in history that is rarely celebrated. There's also the question of the decline of financial profitability, an argument offered by Eric Williams in his foundational work, Capitalism and Slavery. Slavery itself didn't end till emancipation in 1834. It was only possible because slave owners were offered financial compensation. Enforced apprenticeship, which was exactly the same as slavery, then lasted till 1838. Emancipation came in North America in 1863. That's only 25 years difference. At the time of emancipation, there were 800,000 enslaved people still in the Caribbean and British dominions. So, some more facts and figures. Bear with me, it will be worth it. So £20 million of compensation was paid out to Britain's 46,000 slaveholders to compensate them for the loss of their property. The modern equivalent of that is £17 billion. The enslaved received nothing. It was the largest bailout using taxpayers' money in British history until the bailout of the banks in 2009. It represented 40% of the national budget, and the Treasury debt wasn't paid off until 2015. There were many beneficiaries. Gladstone, the Prime Minister William Gladstone's father, was paid £100,000, which is the equivalent of about £80 million. There were countless personal and commercial beneficiaries. We as a society still benefit from the profits of slavery, whether we like it or not. The families of George Orwell, Graham Greene, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, David Cameron, just a few famous names. You didn't have to be upper class. Many people had invested in just one slave. My own family were slaveholders. I have a strong sense of my own position in this material. But no one is exempt, whatever the colour of your skin. This subject concerns you. So about 40% of the owners living in the colonies were women. Then, as now, women tended to outlive their husbands and simply inherited human property through their partners' wills. It adds an interesting element to this discussion. So much for the figures. What about the people, the enslaved themselves? So I'm not going to show you any images here of people in chains being tortured, subjected and victimised that you might associate with slavery. These images appeal to your empathy, but they also blur the boundary between witness and voyeur. I, along with many others, are very uneasy about this double brutalisation of the black body used as spectacle. So on this topic, I want you to think for a moment about the iconography of slavery and the way images are used and were used. The image I'll show you now is the emblem of the anti-slavery movement, which is still often reproduced. It's actually on the front of the Penguin edition of the History of Mary Prince, which is the subject of this talk today. It started out as a man asking the question, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which was transferred to the female with "Am I not a woman and a sister?" But I want you to notice how this image is working. The black man or woman must be kneeling, must be in a lowly position, and he or she must supplicate and beg for freedom, something which was stolen from them in the first place. They must also be half naked to show their raw, their uncivilized state, and they ask a question. They don't make a statement. They don't say, "I am a woman and your sister." So if you contrast this with the images that we might now associate with black power, the raised fist, the defiance, the confidence, this is just to show you the completely different nature of the debate in the 18th and 19th century. The abolitionist movement, who used these images, they deployed specific tactics to target the British people. And that shows in the iconography. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So now let's turn to Mary Prince herself. This talk is about the history that she wrote and the circumstances in which she produced it. Firstly, I want to stress that I will be looking at this text from a literary point of view. It might seem cold to some people, but believe me, I've been working on Mary Prince for many years, and I'm still affected by her suffering and still amazed by her astonishing strength. So it's not to dismiss the emotional power of Mary's work that I'm studying it, that I study it here, and that I will dissect and contextualise it, but it's rather to add to our understanding of her work and her life, in the hope that she will be remembered and celebrated. So we don't have an image of Mary, unfortunately, but there's a photo which is often used to represent her and other enslaved domestic workers. So here you can see how Mary fits into the hierarchy. You can start to imagine what it would mean for a person of such low status to have written a book. Not just any book, but one which accuses the representatives of a nation, in the form of the colonists, one of the most powerful nations in the world, accuses them of barbarism. That's transgressive enough, but this book is written by a woman. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it's written by a black woman. A person of colour was someone who was barely considered as human in the great chain of being. Only by considering these factors can you start to understand what's at stake here. So as you've seen, the book consists of a relatively short story hemmed in by paratext, that is, editorial, supplements, another slave narrative, and in later editions, details of court cases, letters, anti-slavery poems, etc. It's typical of the slave narrative genre that it has had to be surrounded by affidavits and evidence of good and honest character, usually by white men. As the African-American scholar Henry Louis Gates said, authors of African descent who began publishing imaginative literature in English in the late 18th century had to confront a collective and racist text of themselves which Europeans had invented. Black people were not included in the Enlightenment definition of what it was to be an individual. The genre of modern autobiography which was emerging at this time was generally a Western white male preserve. It was based on the view that each individual possesses a unique selfhood, unified selfhood, that is also the expression of universal human nature. It was a literary canon that privileged a specific Enlightenment archetype of sovereign selfhood. However, the concept of the unique selfhood did not include subaltern peoples who largely fell outside the Enlightenment definition of the universal. The African writing subject threatened the whole hierarchy. How could slavery be justified in a world where it was possible for a slave to write a book? That's why slave and freedom narratives were so heavily policed, and why it was so important to qualify them as exceptions. Books like this were dangerous. The abolitionists knew this, which is why Mary Prince was very useful to them for propaganda. Their mission, as we know, was the ending of slavery. But it would be a mistake to think of this mission in terms of equality. People like Wilberforce were anxious to ban slavery on moral and religious grounds. The institution of slavery demeaned the slave owner as much or more than it did the slave. This doesn't discount the idea that some of them still thought of black and mixed race people as inferior. Remember that Wilberforce himself held a dinner to celebrate abolition, where he separated the black guests from the white ones, placing the black diners behind a screen, lest the ladies should be upset. So who were the abolitionists? It's 1830, so the slave trade has been abolished, but slavery itself is still going strong, as is the Anti-Slavery Society, under its original founder, Thomas Clarkson. He was the man who did all the work while Wilberforce languished on the sofa with a headache. You can see here that there are some people of colour and some women in this painting, even though women weren't actually allowed in to a lot of the meetings. There's a story behind that, but that's a story for another time. You might know this as the Anti-Slavery Society, but its actual name was the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions. The clue is in the name. They were a bit slow. This prevaricating stance was not good enough for some people, notably the redoubtable Elizabeth Hayrick, who said that these male abolitionists had shown a great deal too much politeness with their slow, cautious, accommodating measures, and that their aim of gradual abolition was in fact the very masterpiece of satanic policy. She called for immediate, not gradual abolition. It was pressure such as this from the women's groups that eventually forced the men to adopt that policy. At this time, the idea of women intervening in the public sphere was very distasteful. Wilberforce himself said, "For ladies to meet, to publish, to go from house to house stirring up petitions, seems to me proceedings unsuited to the female character." But British women played a key part in introducing slavery into the public consciousness and keeping it there. How did women qualify their association with such activities? Well, they used their gender. They claimed they had special suitability to intervene in matters of the heart. They confined themselves to prescribed female social roles, such as the one celebrated here. By ladies, this subject has been contemplated through the pure medium of virtuous pity, unmixed with those political, commercial, and selfish considerations which operated in steeling the hearts of some men against the pleadings of humanity. They consistently focused on the workings of affect and the sentimental representation of bodily suffering to make their case. They relied on provoking an empathic response from the sympathetic witness, i.e., the reader. Key to this is the belief in the power of sympathy to raise awareness of suffering. Key to this is belief in the power of sympathy to raise awareness of suffering, to change an audience's view of that suffering and to direct their opposition to it. Seems obvious now, but humanitarianism was quite a new idea at the time. Unfortunately, this projection by women onto slaves of their own powerlessness led to depictions of unproblematized, homogenized, voiceless victims and the propagation of stereotypes. Moore's Slavery, a poem of 1788, constructed such a model, which was used and copied for countless other portrayals of the enslaved. The vast bulk of anti-slavery literature at the time created this set of familiar preconceived references, and these, plus a few individual vignettes, risked becoming stand-ins for the real-life institution of slavery. Bring each benighted soul, great God, to thee, and with thy wide salvation make them free. Onto this scene came Mary Prince, a real woman. Mary didn't present as a victim, despite having suffered horrific abuse. She had consistently defied every one of her owners, from the first time she rebelled as a teenager to the time she took her own freedom in London. She was a valuable asset in the household, and she exploited that. She was left in charge, she bargained, she sold goods. Like many slaves, she resisted in many different ways. As Moira Ferguson emphasises, far from being the silenced, gazed upon other, denied experience and individuality in both pro- and anti-slavery texts, Prince defiantly constitutes herself through her utterance, identifying herself to the world as a thinking, feeling woman. So Mary is brought to London in 1830 by Mr. and Mrs. Wood. Having persuaded them to bring her, she hoped the weather might cure her rheumatism. Not much chance of that, and of course it gets worse. She manages to escape to the Anti-Slavery Society. She gets a job as a domestic servant in Thomas Pringle's house in London, the poet and abolitionist. Here she tells her story to Susanna Strickland. The resulting book is edited by Pringle. Susanna Strickland, lodger in Pringle's house, a young literary woman from Suffolk. She writes in her diary that she has been writing Mr. Pringle's Black Mary's life from her dictation, adhering to her own simple language without deviating to the paths of flourish and romance. Mr. Pringle has added an appendix. I hope the work will do much good. Of course, my name does not appear. So not only is Mary perceived as inherently unreliable, but Susanna, the amanuensis, has also been erased. This draws an interesting parallel between the status of women and that of slaves, one which was often made. The chains of marriage were compared to the chains of slavery. Again, the links between women and slaves are emphasised. But back to that house in Pentonville. What really happened there? What processes of editing, mediating, filtering went on? The history portrays Mary as a good Christian woman who mobilises the discourses of religion and sensibility to rally people to her cause. But if you look closely at the text, there are some interesting clues that throw light on her character. Firstly, we can appreciate her idiomatic command of the language, what Pringle calls her peculiar phraseology. There are some lovely metaphors, such as this one. The English people come home from the West Indies and say that slaves don't want to get out of slavery, but they put a cloak about the truth. And when she arrives at the house of her new owners, the Inghams, after the auction, she says, the stones and the timbers were the best thing in it. They were not so hard as the hearts of the owners. She's also not afraid to claim authority and to speak on behalf of others. I tell it to let English people know the truth. All slaves want to be free. In the sections on religion, we can detect the guiding hand of the abolitionists. Nor must I forget the Reverend Mr. Mortimer, which suggests that she has forgotten him. I trust in God. I have profited by what I have heard from him. She doesn't seem convinced. She'd have just said, I've profited from it. Mr. Mortimer tells me that I must pray to God to change my heart and make me know the truth, and the truth will make me free. Can the echoes of an argument be detected in the use of the words such as must and make me? Some element of coercion could be at play here. I enjoy the great privilege of being enabled to attend church 3 times on Sunday. Well, that just sounds ironic. So as a playwright, I'm interested in Mary's language and in these allusions, suggestions, these small ways of winning authority. We can also look at other sources for clues. Thomas Pringle lets slip at some point in the editorial that Mary feels deep, though unobtrusive gratitude for real kindness shown to her. I love that, unobtrusive. Also, that she has a somewhat violent and hasty temper and a considerable share of natural pride and self-importance. These are traits that were absolutely not desirable in a female. But of course, with these kind of descriptions, we begin to see what enabled Mary to break away, to get through, to survive. Because she had a good dose of what we might now see as really positive attributes. We also have to pay attention to the silences in the text. Its use as propaganda for the anti-slavery movement meant that Prince must appear morally unimpeachable. This censure meant not only erasing any sexual abuse, and we know from other sources that virtually all enslaved women were sexually abused, but also any trace of her own sexual agency. References to her sexuality are very limited, and the complete silence on the subject of children could point to abolitionist moral concerns over illegitimacy or miscegenation. Could also point to the fact that she was so badly abused she couldn't have children, but we will never know. She's known to have had relations with both freed black men and white men, which was another way to gain power in colonial society. When Pringle was sued for libel after he published the book, Mary was called to give evidence. The courtroom reports are very telling. Witness, which is Mary, had lived 7 years with Captain Abbott. One night she found another woman in bed with the captain. This woman had pretended to be a friend of the witness. Laughter. She beat her, and the woman was obliged to get out of bed. Laughter. She told all this to Miss Strickland when that lady took down her narrative. Of course, these things are not in the history. This is an indication of Mary's character. She beat the other woman. She made people laugh in the court. She was sleeping for 7 years, or living for 7 years with Captain Abbott. These things are all missing from the history. So to conclude, you can see how we can build up a picture of how Mary's history was shaped by the abolitionists. Pringle claims in the editorial that no fact of importance has been omitted, and not a single circumstance or sentiment has been added. This clearly depends on your definition of importance, and what's important changes over time. To us, some of the most important elements of Mary's story are the parts that were left out. So it's only by looking at the circumstances surrounding her, the paratext, the court cases, the letters to newspapers and petitions to Parliament, that we can start to develop our understanding of how an autobiography, a memoir essentially, can become a piece of propaganda. The abolitionists knew the power of a personal story. Even today, humanitarian organisations still use personal testimony in this way. And of course, without the abolitionists, social networks and political reach, we might never have had the chance to read Mary Prince's story, which is still packing a punch later.